If you're anything like me, you probably don't want to listen to people tell you about all the mistakes that you're making. You probably just want to keep making them and somehow quietly realize on your own that you are making mistakes and then correct it, but waste so much time in between because you could have just listened to somebody in the first place. In today's video, I'm going to be going over what I think are probably the most common sewing mistakes that you can make. Don't worry if you're making mistakes. Sewing is not easy and there's always room to improve. The first place that you might be going wrong is your scissors. Make sure that you have scissors that are specifically for fabric. You can get them at any fabric store or craft store or online. Just make sure that they specify for fabric. I don't buy very expensive sewing scissors and they work perfectly, so don't think that you have to spend like $50 on a pair of scissors. Just make sure they're specifically for fabric. Now once you get your fabric scissors, make sure that you are only using them on fabric. I can't stress this enough. Don't use them on anything else. If there's one thing that you take away from this video, let it be that. Don't let anybody touch them either. Like if you have to put tape on it that says like don't touch my sewing scissors, don't let them out of your sight basically, and don't use them on anything other than fabric because you don't want to ruin them. You can also get them sharpened if you have a knife sharpener, or you can take them into the fabric store. My local fabric store offers scissor sharpening for like 10 bucks or something. So that's a great option to kind of extend the life of your fabric scissors. The next mistake you might be making is a real pain to correct, honestly, and that is not ironing your seams. Sewing is like 50% ironing, I swear. This is something that I don't necessarily do all the time, but when you do, trust me, it's just gonna make such a difference. It helps your project to just go smoother the entire time. You don't have to like hold your seams down when you're sewing over them or use as many pins or clips or anything like that. Like it's just, trust me, it's just gonna help you so much. So after you sew something down, iron it. If you're sewing a side seam, for example, iron that open, or if you hem something, press it right away. It's just gonna make your project look so much more professional and not homemade. The next mistake that you might be making, and if you're here from TikTok, you're probably gonna roll your eyes, but it's not cleaning your machine. Cannot stress enough how big of a difference this might make. I think some machines might be more sensitive to it because a lot of people comment on my videos saying that they've never cleaned their machine and they've been sewing for years and they've never had a problem. But my machine specifically, if I don't clean it for a few projects, especially depending on what the fiber is, if it's especially like linty and fills up the machine a lot, it will just stop working properly. If you're like skipping stitches or it's pulling or your thread is getting tangled, I honestly don't know exactly why this happens because I'm not a sewing machine expert, but I do know that most often when I'm having a problem with a seam, if I clean my machine, it's almost always resolved after. I think this is the same on most machines. This is how it is on mine at least. The plate that sits under the presser foot has a screw in there. So you unscrew it and then you'll be looking at the bobbin. So take your bobbin out. Somebody correct me on machine terminology because I don't know, but the case that holds your bobbin, if that comes out, lift that out, and then take like a tiny paintbrush or makeup brush or something like that, or if your machine came with a brush for cleaning. If you haven't cleaned your machine ever, you'll probably be shocked at how much stuff is gathered in there. The next mistake that you might be making is not changing your needle. So this goes for a couple different instances. Different people say different things about how often you should be changing your needle. I would say maybe like every few projects. I don't do this as often as I should do it. If your machine is just running like a little bit clunky, I don't know if this makes sense, but if you can hear your needle puncturing the fabric as you're sewing, that's probably a sign that your needle is getting really dull and you need to change it. That's usually how I can tell because I honestly just forget to change it. You'll notice once you change to a sharp needle, you won't be hearing that anymore. The other way that I remember to change my needle is when it just gets so dull that it breaks. So if you've snapped a needle before, you know it's very startling and annoying. So just keep on top of changing it as often as you can remember. I've heard from people too that you can sharpen needles. I don't know if that will work well, but you could give that a try if you don't want to keep rebuying needles. Another thing in regards to needles as well is that if you are sewing with a specific type of fabric, it requires a specific size of needle. The sizes might seem kind of confusing at first if you've never really paid attention to it, but just Google it and it will tell you like what type of needle to use on chiffon or denim or whatever it might be. The next mistake that you might be making is not using anything to hold your fabric in place. So pins, sewing clips, pattern weights, any of these things are going to make your life so much easier. I was really stubborn when I started sewing, and I hated using pins for some reason. I really don't know why, because they really do just help you a lot. If you're a complete beginner, I would say use pins or sewing clips as much as you can. I think that when you're first starting out sewing, it can feel a little bit second nature. So using pins or clips to hold everything in place is just really going to help you not have to focus on holding all the fabric in place and focus more on your stitching and getting that down pat. And then once you become more advanced, of course, you can just use them where you see fit. For example, most of the time when I'm doing just a straight seam, I don't use pins unless it's like a slippery fabric, but I will use them if I'm doing any sort of like intricate detail or any curves or anything that needs to be lined up exactly perfect. The next mistake that you might be making is not using a consistent seam allowance or not even paying attention to seam allowance at all. Seam allowance, for anyone who doesn't know, is basically just the space between where your seam is and where the edge of the fabric is. There's really handy notches on the plate of your sewing machine that show you measurements for seam allowances. So it's really easy to line your fabric up with that as a guide. Especially if you're using a pattern, seam allowance is really important. It's just going to ensure that everything lines up exactly perfectly. Even if seam allowance isn't integral to the fit of your garment as much, it's just going to look nicer if you use a consistent one throughout the entire project. It's just all going to look more clean and more professional. So speaking of seam allowances, the next mistake that you might be making is not properly finishing your seams. This is not the most important thing, especially when you're starting out. I wouldn't stress out about it. I used to just be so annoyed and I would get so mad at myself for having any sort of fraying seams on the inside of garments, but I was really the only one who was seeing them anyways. But for certain fabrics, in terms of like structural integrity of the garment, it does matter because you don't want something that will fray too much. So if you use a really small seam allowance and don't finish it properly, it might completely fray and your seam might break. A lot of people use sergers to finish their seams. That's a whole separate machine though. So if you don't have a setup for that, that's totally fine. There's a few other really easy ways that you can do this. My personal favorite ways that I think are just really easy to finish seams are pinking shears, which are a pair of scissors that have a zigzag blade, and they basically just ensure that the fabric only frays as far as the zigzag cuts into the fabric. If you're working with like a cotton or sheeting or linen or something like that, like that's where pinking shears will be really amazing. Another thing that I like doing is using a zigzag stitch. So when I sew a straight seam, I'll cut about a 1/4 inch, and then I just put my machine on a zigzag stitch, and then I run this stitch sort of over the edge of the fabric, kind of like a faux serge. The edge of the fabric should be lining up with the center point of the needle so that it goes on the outside and then on the inside, and that will sort of bind the edge of your fabric. There's tons of resources out there to learn more about different ways to do that. Those are just a few of my personal favorites. The next mistake that you might be making, and this is still a little bit of a mystery to me, honestly, it's just one of my biggest annoyances when it comes to sewing, and that is your sewing machine's tension. So if you're having problems with your tension, I think it will be pretty obvious. There should be a guide in your sewing machine's manual, or you can Google this to show you what your seams will look like if you need to reduce or increase the tension. There's also an ideal tension required for specific types of fabric. So if you're experiencing trouble with your seam, like it's skipping stitches or it's pulling the fabric, or the stitches aren't like evenly spaced on the top and bottom, it's hard to describe, but if it's happening, I think you'll understand. Definitely refer to your manual or online and test out a few different tensions on a scrap piece of that fabric so that you can kind of find the perfect one. Don't stress about this too much. I don't really care to like memorize my tension guide, so I just sort of adjust it when I have a problem, and that works perfectly for me. There are probably so many more mistakes that we are all making when we're sewing, so if you think of any more, comment them down below. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it didn't make you feel too bad about your sewing habits, but hopefully this can help you if you've been experiencing any sort of problems with your sewing projects recently. Maybe this can give you a bit of a jump off point to see where you can kind of correct some of your habits and improve. So if you found this video helpful, give it a like, subscribe if you want to see more videos from me, and I'll see you next time.